Good evening. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jorge and Sydney, and thank you very much also Architekturforum Zürich for bringing us here. I'm going to continue from where Jorge stopped, not the less money part, but I'm going to continue with the school part here. And I'm here presenting, my name is Wesam Asali. I'm wearing two hats here. The first one is me being a PhD student, whose work is about craft reconstruction. I'm focusing primarily on earth, shell, and masonry techniques, and I'm interested in particular in a dialogue between skill, craftsmanship, and design, where I always look at ways of simplifications and accessibility to construction. And this actually has to do a lot with the second hand that I have, which is being a militant and part of emergency architecture and human rights in the side of material and construction. I'm going to talk about the right to build. So it's not going to be about what the school will function for. It's going to be about the momentum in which we will be building this school, which we think it is also a medium. It is also a period of time in which we can actually have a lot to say as architects and builders. The work of emergency architecture and human rights on the context of Syria is not new. When I moved from Damascus to Copenhagen in 2012, and it was the beginning of the crisis, we started to work together, bringing students from Copenhagen, from Danish universities, and students from Syrian universities to have a dialogue about, at that time we were talking about cities, we were talking about how the experience, the spatial dimension of the conflict in Syria through the eyes of Syrian students. We were very keen on making this bridge between Copenhagen and Damascus, because we felt that students there are pretty much, architecture students are isolated. So here we run several workshops in parallel. Most of them were like online, where we had the communication between the two cities. I'm just briefly showing some of the impressions or some of the how to use the tools of architecture, not to build but actually to express oneself. So here there is a measurement of light during the day when there is no electricity. A little bit anger towards humanity. Probably a statement about regaining streets again, or chaos. Well, in emergency architecture and human rights, and during this workshop, we were very interested on the theme of displacement, as Jorge explained. In that, we think that the current model of in the way in which we deal with displacement is very problematic. We set two goals. One is to work with refugees in the reception areas, and one to work with refugees in the high concentrated areas around Syria, namely the refugee camps. We look at these two pictures, and we think that I want you to think, what is the temporary? What structure is temporary between the two? We believe that the subject of temporary and permanence goes beyond being a light structure. It's actually being something that has to do about the cycle of production and the degradation of the material and growing the material again. So it's about a building that grows and ends in its situ, rather than a tent that you buy and install. These two concepts come together. This first concept comes together with another one that has to do with who actually builds and who are going to be the partner to make this school, this object happen. In 2013, right after a truce in one area around Damascus, people had partially damaged houses. They didn't wait for any assessment or anything. They were just there and starting to build. Another statistics says that half of Damascus is produced by a popular builder. So do we actually, do planners and architects have a word to say about, do they actually have the power to plan? What is the regular and irregular? What is the formal and informal? What is the legal and illegal. So in this concept, we think that if we thought about the material and the partnership with the people, we can actually know exactly how the construction of the school can happen. I'm going to rather swiftly move to, I'm trying to run a little bit so we can have a little bit of a time. I'm going to run swiftly to a sort of the material and the way in which we were going to build these schools. We are going to build these schools with compressed earth blocks that might be stabilized with a percentage of cement. We're going to use compression-only structures. Here I'm being a little bit technical, but I guess it would be great to share this technicality with you, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A. We're going to use tile vaulting, something that is known very much in Spain as bóveda tabicada, or bóveda catalana. And the technique is very simple. You use a tile, but instead of a ceramic tile, traditionally, it's not a compressed tile. But instead of putting it that way, you put it like this, and then you put the other one next to it. And you use plaster of Paris to put the two tiles together. Because plaster of Paris sits really fast, it sticks really fast. Within a minute, you can actually leave it, and it will be cantilevered. So in that, you don't need a lot of formwork. So we save a lot of wood, we save a lot of metal, a temporary shuttering for the vaults that we were going to be. We can avoid by using simple guidelines and a technique. Well, this technique is very also, it's interesting because it also traveled around the world. It has something to do with the knowledge exchange between different periods and areas as well. So we see a building in the US by Guastavino, who immigrated to the US at the beginning of the 20th century, and he built many buildings using this technique. And then we also have an exemplary sort of monumental school of art in Cuba that was also built for the same reason. But this technique doesn't have to stay in the way it is. Some people, genius people, they took it and developed it locally to different circumstances. Here I'm bringing Eladio Dieste, who took the technique and he reinforced it, and then he could do a lot of large span, very beautiful industrial and also religious buildings. This is a map in which you see how the routes of immigration that Jorge showed. This is the immigration of the material along the time, and you can see that we don't know exactly where it starts, but it moves from one place to another. Rather, with mainly in the case of Latin America, with refugees, by the way, they took the technique there. The other interesting aspect of the construction with this is that it's always been used as a low-cost medium. In the two pictures here in Spain and Cuba, it was used when they had no money and they couldn't do reinforced concrete. So they had to look for an alternative, and then this material came out. There are two different contexts. The Spanish one, the technique is traditional. The Cuban one, the technique is imported. But in both cases, it was actually low cost. Now, we work with craftsmen who actually does the structures. We've been working on the material itself, so it's not a new encounter with the tile vaulting here. We are working on ways in which we can minimize the use of formwork and the wood. Here we used only bended engineered bamboo to make the shape of those three small structures. Later we also worked on similar structures but we were experimenting with making them not on site, but somewhere else, and then bring them to the site and build them very rapidly. So it's this dialogue, again, between industrialization and modern construction. I'm not gonna, I mean, we had a lot of problems doing this because it was the first time, but we're pretty much open to these kind of alterations and learning. This is another project that I was happy to be part of the making of it. It's actually of my supervisor, Light Earth Design, and I was part of making the guide work for these 3 vaults for the cricket stadium. And I was also part of the assessment of the technology transfer. I don't like very much calling it this way, but the training of the people there. And we find out that we have to at training, you cannot just go with a building and throw the building at the technique and then you assume people would actually continue using the technique, but you have to make sure that the assimilation of the building and the adaptation of the building to the local circumstances is actually conducted. So here we were simplifying the construction to be from these very expressive structures to very small structures that can be used in housing. The last dimension that we want to talk about is we're also developing a program that has to do with the construction for kids. And this is part of the projects I was doing before coming to Denmark and now to Cambridge. We had a school for children about architecture and the built environment. So we were talking about Damascus mainly, we were talking about traditional techniques, we were talking about how cities is being shaped. And we would really like to continue this in the school, in our schools in emergency architecture and human rights. So we actually think that the built environment is really important matter for a new generation to be part of their education. In the same way, I'd like to take the opportunity to mention that in emergency architecture and human rights, we also have now we're talking about the new rule of architects. We have a Master Emergency and Resilience in cooperation with the University Instituto in Venice. About the architects, this is Muhammad Saeed al-Qasimi. He, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was bored. He's a sheikh, so he was like a religious figure in Damascus. He was bored and he wanted to have a new project, and he asked his son, what should I do? He told him, why don't you write about the professions and craftsmanship in Damascus? So he said, yeah, that's a good idea. He took his donkey, and then he moved wander around Damascus and writing about the craftsmen and the people and the artisans in the city. So he's one of the anthropologists, very, very early anthropologists that I know that wrote about Damascus. He has a quote that I think is very interesting for us to sort of know what sort of architecture and architects we, at least, I'm talking about me, should be. And he says, city matters are clear only to those who know how construction in all its details. Authorities often have recourse to the opinion of these men to understand better construction matters in cities where people compete with each other for space and air, above and below, and for the use of the outside of the building. So here we have a knowledge about how to build, and also a social mediation between different parts of the society and between the society and the authorities. And with that quote, I would end my talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.